The young American pilot rubbed his eyes, incredulous at what he saw through the cockpit window of his F-6F Hellcat. "Base Charlie, this is Falcon 3. Confirm my position." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the deep confusion and astonishment he felt as he kept his gaze fixed on the metallic silhouettes cutting through the blue Pacific sky less than 2 kilometers away. "Position confirmed, Falcon 3. You are 320 kilometers east of Iwo Jima. By any problem?" The mission control response sounded routine, almost bored, completely disconnected from the shock the pilot was experiencing at that moment. "Charlie, I'm observing I repeat, three Soviet-designed aircraft, possibly Yak-9s, flying in close formation to my northeast, heading towards... Hell, I don't know where they're going, but they're definitely Yaks." A sepulchral silence followed on the radio, finally broken by a different, deeper voice, presumably that of a superior officer. "Falcon 3, this is Commander Hayes. Repeat your last transmission and confirm sighting." The pilot swallowed hard, adjusting his helmet as he maneuvered his aircraft to maintain a safe distance from the mysterious planes. "Gentlemen, I am seeing 3 Soviet Yak-9 fighters flying in the airspace of the Central Pacific, more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest Soviet coast. I am absolutely certain of the identification." The implications were surreal. Russian planes couldn't be there. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan just 3 days earlier, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and its actions should have been limited to Manchuria on the Asian continent. The Central Pacific was an exclusively American theater of operations. "Falcon 3, maintain distance but follow these planes. Do not initiate contact. I repeat, do not initiate contact under any circumstances. Photographic documentation authorized if possible. Other elements are being dispatched to your position immediately." What followed that mysterious meeting in August 1945 would remain classified for decades, revealing one of the most extraordinary and little-known technology transfer operations of World War II, a story that redefined the balance of power in the nascent confrontation that would soon be known as the Cold War. As World War II drew to its bitter end in the Pacific in the summer of 1945, the world had changed irrevocably. 2 atomic bombs had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a new geopolitical reality was beginning to take shape in the ashes of the global conflict. The United States emerged as the undisputed superpower in the Pacific, having defeated the Japanese Navy and Air Force in a series of decisive battles that spanned 3 years of brutal warfare. The American military presence dominated the vast expanses of the ocean, with aircraft carriers, bases on strategic islands, and near absolute control of airspace. This dominance was considered unquestionable, especially in the Central Pacific regions, far from the Asian coast. The United States Navy and Air Force had established a surveillance and control network that was supposed to detect any enemy aircraft attempting to penetrate these airspaces, or so American strategists believed. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had concentrated its gigantic military machine on the European front, where it waged an existential war against Nazi Germany. Its involvement in the war against Japan was, by comparison, minimal until the final stages of the conflict. Stalin had maintained a non-aggression pact with Tokyo, allowing the Red Army to concentrate its resources against Hitler. However, in the Yalta agreements in February 1945, Stalin promised the Allies that he would enter the war against Japan approximately 3 months after the defeat of Germany. Fulfilling this promise with calculated precision, the USSR declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, 2 days after the bombing of Hiroshima and 1 day before the attack on Nagasaki. Operation August Storm, as the Soviet offensive was called, focused on Manchuria, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, all territories on or near the Asian continent. Soviet aviation, while having become a formidable fighting force on the European front, was not known for its ability to project power over long distances, especially over vast ocean expanses. The Yakovlev Yak-9s, although excellent fighters, had limited range and were not designed for long-range maritime operations. The infrastructure necessary to sustain air operations in the Central Pacific, including forward bases, supply ships, navigation systems, and search and rescue units, simply did not exist in the Soviet arsenal of that period. By conventional military logic, it was literally impossible for Soviet fighters to have been operating in the depths of the Pacific in August 1945, and yet, there they were. The encounter reported by the Hellcat pilot was not an isolated incident. In the following weeks, more sightings occurred, all carefully documented and immediately classified with the highest levels of secrecy. B-29 bomber crews returning from missions against Japan, fighter pilots on routine patrols, and even PBY Catalina naval reconnaissance aircraft reported brief glimpses of aircraft that couldn't be there. Most of these encounters followed a similar pattern. The Soviet aircraft did not exhibit hostile behavior, maintained a safe distance from American aircraft, and quickly disappeared when pursued or approached. For the top echelons of the American military, these reports represented a perplexing and potentially alarming enigma. How could Soviet aircraft be operating thousands of kilometers beyond their normal range in a region where the US maintained absolute supremacy? What was the purpose of such flights? And most importantly, how were they being logistically sustained? The strategic implications were profound. If the Soviets had developed the capability to project air power in the Central Pacific, this represented a significant upheaval in post-war geopolitical calculations. The answer to this mystery remained hidden in classified files for decades, revealing a fascinating story of technical ingenuity, operational audacity, and political machinations that transcended the traditional lines of the alliance against the Axis. What American pilots witnessed in those final days of the war was the result of a secret operation that had begun months earlier, involving an unlikely collaboration between specific elements of the Soviet and American governments, with profound ramifications for the future global balance of power. This is the story of how Soviet fighter jets that shouldn't have been there ended up in the Pacific, and how their appearance served as a prelude to the long and tense competition that would characterize the next few decades of world politics. It is a narrative of innovation under extreme pressure, of technological limits overcome by necessity and ingenuity, and of how the transfer of knowledge between allies in wartime can, ironically, set the conditions for future rivalries. Above all, it is a little-known chapter of history that illustrates how even in the final moments of the greatest conflict humanity has ever known, the seeds of future tensions were already being sown in the seas and skies of the Pacific. The presence of Soviet Yak-9 fighters in the Central Pacific in August 1945 had its roots in events that occurred almost a year earlier, at a crucial moment in the war when alliances were tested and new strategies began to take shape. To understand how these aircraft ended up in a place where they logically could not be, it is necessary to go back in time and examine a series of decisions, innovations, and compromises made behind the scenes of the Grand Alliance against the Axis. The starting point of this extraordinary saga dates back to October 1944, when a Soviet technical delegation secretly visited American military installations in Hawaii, officially as part of preparations for the eventual entry of the USSR into the war against Japan. Led by General Pavel Fedorovich Zygarev, a veteran aviator and then commander of the Soviet Long-Range Air Force, the delegation included aeronautical engineers, logistics specialists, and intelligence officers. Their visit coincided with a time when American planners were beginning to seriously contemplate the possibility of an invasion of mainland Japan, Operation Downfall, which, according to the most conservative estimates, would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, was among those who saw potential strategic value in coordinating future Soviet efforts against Japan with American operations in the Pacific. The initial idea was simple. If the Soviets could launch significant attacks against Japanese forces in Manchuria and northern China, this would divide the attention and resources of the Japanese High Command, potentially reducing the resistance faced by American forces in the invasion of Japan's main islands. This strategic logic, perfectly sensible in the context of the war, opened the door to a series of technical discussions that would eventually lead to the development of Soviet fighter capability in the Central Pacific. During their stay in Hawaii, Zygarev and his team demonstrated particular interest in American techniques for air operations over vast ocean expanses. The US had developed an unprecedented logistical system that allowed it to project air power over distances previously considered absolutely impossible, precisely the type of strategic capability that the Soviet Union lacked and secretly coveted for its post-war expansion plans. In conversations that initially focused on potential cooperation against Japan, the Soviets began to explore the possibility of adapting their own fighter jets for long-range maritime operations. Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, then Chief of Pacific War Planning, was one of the first American officers to realize the Soviets' true objective. In a confidential memo to Marshall dated November 1944, he wrote, Our Soviet allies demonstrate an interest that goes beyond mere tactical coordination for the defeat of Japan. Their questions and observations suggest a long-term objective to independently develop air power projection capability over maritime environments, a skill that currently only our Navy and Air Force possess on a global scale. Sherman, demonstrating remarkable foresight, added, "We must carefully consider the strategic implications of any technology transfer in this domain. The shared knowledge to defeat a common enemy today may underpin capabilities we will face tomorrow in less favorable geopolitical circumstances." His words would prove prophetic, but were temporarily overshadowed by the immediate need to secure Soviet cooperation against Japan, a priority that, at that moment, outweighed concerns about possible future consequences. The Soviet delegation returned to Moscow with valuable information on ocean navigation, in-flight refueling systems, aircraft modifications for maritime operations, and naval survival techniques. What followed was an extraordinary engineering and adaptation effort, conducted with characteristic Soviet pragmatism and driven by Stalin's desire to secure influence in the post-war reordering of the Pacific. The center of this effort was the prestigious Central Institute of Aerohydrodynamics, (CISAGI) in Moscow, where a team led by the brilliant aeronautical engineer Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev, the same one who designed the Yak series, worked intensively to modify the already excellent Yak-9 for long-range overwater capability. Yakovlev faced formidable challenges. The Yak-9 was a land-based fighter designed for short-range air superiority, not for long ocean crossings. Its navigation system was rudimentary compared to American equipment. Its fuel range was limited, and it lacked maritime survival equipment. The resulting modifications, internally designated Yak-9M OK, Okeansky, Oceanic, included drastically enlarged auxiliary fuel tanks, improved navigation systems based on technology partially derived from American Lend-Lease equipment, inflatable emergency floats, and specialized survival equipment for the pilots. The VK-107A engines were meticulously recalibrated for maximum cruising efficiency, sacrificing some combat performance in favor of extended range. These modifications managed to nearly double the Yak-9's operational range, but still fell far short of what was needed for independent operations in the Central Pacific. Here enters the most audacious element of the Soviet plan: the creation of a clandestine logistical support network in the Pacific, using apparently civilian merchant ships modified to serve as refueling and maintenance points. The Soviet Directorate of Naval Intelligence, RUMR, coordinated the acquisition and conversion of several cargo ships through front companies, mainly based in the recently acquired Sakhalin and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. These ships were discreetly equipped with specialized fuel tanks, camouflaged military communication equipment, and even partially submersible platforms that could be used for emergency aircraft maintenance. Alongside these technical efforts, an equally sophisticated diplomatic and intelligence campaign was conducted to create the necessary cover for the operations. Soviet diplomats negotiated scientific and meteorological cooperation agreements with various Pacific nations, establishing pretexts for the presence of their ships on normal commercial routes that strategically crossed the areas where the flights were planned. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, recruited and positioned agents in key Pacific ports to facilitate discreet refueling and transmit meteorological and security information. In a display of audacity bordering on recklessness, the Soviets even established contact with select elements of the Korean anti-Japanese resistance and with fishing communities on small Pacific islands, creating a network of potential footholds should any aircraft need to make an emergency landing. This makeshift support network was far from ideal and certainly could not sustain large-scale operations, but it provided a tenuous lifeline for the ambitious reconnaissance flights that were being planned. Pilot training for these extraordinary missions began in January 1945 at the Elisovo Air Base in Kamchatka. Only the most experienced aviators were selected, decorated veterans of the Western Front with thousands of flight hours and dozens of victories against the Luftwaffe. Even for these aces, the proposed missions represented an unprecedented challenge. Training included advanced ocean navigation, fuel conservation techniques, sea survival procedures, and familiarization with the behavior of American air patrols in the Pacific. Information obtained through a combination of official diplomatic sources, observation of communication patterns, and clandestine intelligence. Colonel Ivan Nikitovich Kozhedub, top Soviet ace of the war with 62 confirmed victories against the Germans, was initially considered to lead the program, but Stalin personally vetoed his participation, deeming him too valuable to risk in such a dangerous operation. Instead, command was given to Colonel Alexander Ivanovich Pokrishkin, second highest Soviet ace and a respected tactical innovator, known for his adaptability and independent thinking, essential qualities for a mission where pilots would be operating without conventional support under conditions unprecedented in Soviet doctrine. In April 1945, with Germany's defeat clearly imminent, the project entered its final preparation phase. 12 Yak-9M OK aircraft were completed and secretly transported to bases in Kamchatka and Sakhalin. Support ships were positioned on their designated routes, disguised as ordinary freighters carrying goods between Soviet, Chinese, and Korean ports. The selected pilots completed their specialized training and awaited only the order to begin operations. This order arrived on August 9, 1945, the same day Nagasaki was bombed and the Soviet Union formally entered the war against Japan. The timing was no coincidence. The Soviet leadership correctly anticipated that American attention would be focused on the effects of the atomic bombs and the Japanese response, creating a window of opportunity to discreetly begin operations in the Central Pacific. Furthermore, the declaration of war provided perfect cover for intensified Soviet air activity, which would presumably be interpreted as part of the offensive in Manchuria and surrounding regions. First flight of the modified Yak-9s over the deep waters of the Pacific took place in the early morning of August 11, 1945. 3 aircraft, led by Pokrishkin himself, took off from the Kamchatka Peninsula and flew eastward, following a meticulously planned route that would take them over the Kuril Islands, recently invaded by Soviet forces, and then into the airspace of the North Pacific. Their final destination was an area approximately halfway between the Aleutian Islands and the Hawaiian archipelago, a region where they could observe movement patterns of the American fleet without necessarily coming into direct contact with patrol aircraft. It was an extraordinary journey that tested the limits of both the machines and the men who piloted them. Flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection, constantly monitoring their fuel gauges, and navigating through often adverse weather conditions, the pilots demonstrated remarkable skill and courage. Approximately 8 hours after takeoff, they reached the designated area, conducted limited reconnaissance, and then returned following a different route that would lead them to a planned rendezvous with one of the disguised support ships for refueling before their final return to base. This first mission was completed without incident or detection, a success that encouraged subsequent missions, gradually expanding the scope and ambition of the operations. It was during one of these later missions, on August 14th, that the encounter described at the beginning of this narrative occurred, the first confirmed visual contact between an American pilot and Soviet Yaks that by all conventional estimates should not have been where they were. What did the Soviets hope to achieve with these extraordinarily risky flights? The objectives were multiple and reflected the long-term strategic vision that was beginning to emerge in Moscow as World War II drew to a close and a new world order took shape. First, there was the immediate practical objective of gathering intelligence on American naval concentrations and movements in the Pacific. Even with Japan on the verge of defeat, detailed knowledge of the capabilities and operational patterns of the Navy that now dominated the world's largest ocean was invaluable to Soviet military planners. Secondly, the mission served as a real test of concepts and technologies that the Soviets had developed or adapted. The ability to project air power over vast oceanic distances had until then been an American and British monopoly. By demonstrating that they could, albeit on a limited scale, operate combat aircraft in the Central Pacific, the Soviets established credentials as a global naval air power, not just as the land-based giant that had defeated Hitler. Third, and perhaps most significant from a geopolitical standpoint, the presence, even if transitory and tenuous, of Soviet aircraft in airspace previously considered exclusively American sent a subtle but unequivocal message to the leadership in Washington. The Soviet Union was claiming a seat at the table when the future of the Pacific was decided. It was, in essence, a physical manifestation of Stalin's determination to be treated as an equal in the emerging bipolar post-war order. The flights continued with varying intensity until the end of August 1945, when Japan formally surrendered. During this brief period, the modified Yak-9s completed approximately 20 missions over the Central Pacific, collecting valuable data and inadvertently causing considerable consternation among American commanders who gradually became aware of this unexpected presence in their presumed domain. The American response to these sightings was characterized by confusion and concern. Admiral Chester Nimitz ordered search operations to identify Soviet forward operating bases or support ships. Naval intelligence directed resources to monitor Soviet communications and suspicious movements. The effort eventually yielded results, identifying disguised support ships and beginning to unravel the logistical network that made the Yak flights possible. In Washington, the broader strategic significance of the Soviet flights was quickly recognized. In a classified memorandum to President Truman dated August 23, newly appointed Secretary of State James F. Burns wrote, "The Soviet ability to operate military aircraft in the Central Pacific, even on a limited scale, fundamentally alters our negotiating position on post-war arrangements in that region. This demonstration of reach and persistence suggests that we cannot simply presume exclusive access or influence, even in areas previously considered unquestionably within our sphere." The emerging crisis was partially diffused by larger events. Japan's formal surrender on September 2nd naturally redirected American priorities toward occupation and reconstruction. Soviet flights ceased after the surrender, having served their strategic and intelligence purposes. The issue was then discreetly moved to diplomatic channels, with the U.S. State Department making formal representations to Moscow about unauthorized aerial activities in international airspace, carefully avoiding direct accusations that could escalate tensions in the delicate post-war period. The Soviet response was a study in diplomatic ambiguity. They neither explicitly denied nor confirmed the operations, offering only vague assurances that all Soviet air activities had been conducted in accordance with international agreements and as part of their commitment to contributing to the defeat of Japan. This deliberately opaque response reflected the approach that would characterize much of Soviet interaction with the West during the Cold War years, maintaining enough ambiguity to preserve diplomatic flexibility while clearly signaling capabilities and intentions to informed observers. The Yak episode in the Pacific gradually faded from headlines as more pressing post-war era concerns took priority. However, its impact on American strategic assessments was lasting. The demonstration of Soviet technical ingenuity, operational determination, and geopolitical ambition significantly informed developing American military thinking about the nature of the emerging competition with the USSR. The technical lessons drawn from the analysis of the Yak operations were particularly valuable. The Americans were simultaneously impressed by Soviet ingenuity and relieved by the evident limitations of their approach. As one naval intelligence report observed, the Soviet solution is characteristically improvised and dependent on individual heroism, effective for limited demonstrations, but fundamentally inadequate for sustained combat operations. This assessment, while accurate in the specific context of the Yak flights, underestimated the Soviet capacity to transform expedient improvisations into institutionalized capabilities over time, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the Cold War. For the Soviets, Operation Yak Pacific, known internally by the codename Operation Albatross, was considered a qualified success. The technical, intelligence, and strategic objectives were largely achieved, albeit at a significant cost and with less secrecy than initially expected. The lessons learned, particularly related to long-range maritime air operations, expeditionary logistics, and operational characteristics of American naval aviation, were meticulously documented and incorporated into subsequent Soviet doctrinal development. Most significantly, the experience provided a conceptual model for what would eventually become a central component of Soviet naval strategy in the following decades: the ability to challenge American maritime dominance through asymmetric and unconventional means. As Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the visionary commander who would transform the Soviet Navy during the Cold War, noted in his memoirs, special operations of the summer of 1945 demonstrated a fundamental principle that would guide our naval thinking. Even the most dominant maritime power possesses vulnerabilities that can be exploited by an adaptive and determined adversary. The technical ingenuity demonstrated in modifying the Yak-9 for long-range maritime operations established important precedents that would influence later Soviet developments. Many of the improvised solutions devised by Yakovlev's team, particularly those related to navigation systems, fuel tank configurations, and survival equipment, were refined and incorporated into subsequent generations of Soviet aircraft. The experience also highlighted critical limitations that would need to be overcome, especially in the area of reliable and fuel-efficient aircraft engines, a vulnerability that would persist in Soviet aviation for decades. The most innovative aspect of the operation was arguably its logistical concept, the creation of a distributed and concealed support network using seemingly civilian assets to sustain military operations in an environment where conventional infrastructure was impossible. This concept, born out of extreme necessity, contained the seeds of what would eventually be formalized in Soviet doctrine as maskirovka military infrastructure, the systematic use of disguises, dual structures, and strategic camouflage to create military capabilities where an adversary does not expect them. In the years immediately following the war, as the alliance against the Axis rapidly deteriorated into mutual distrust and global competition, the key participants in Operation Albatross followed divergent paths, reflecting the complexities of the emerging era. Alexander Pokrishkin, the brilliant commander of the pioneering flights, received his third Hero of the Soviet Union Star, an extremely rare recognition, but the citation mentioned only his exploits on the European front. His participation in the Pacific operations remained unofficially acknowledged for decades. He eventually rose to the rank of Air Marshal, but maintained a strict silence about Operation Albatross until his death in 1985. Alexander Yakovlev, the engineering genius behind the Yak-9 modifications, applied many of the lessons learned in the development of new generations of Soviet fighter jets, eventually including the USSR's first truly effective naval jets. His prestige as chief designer remained unshaken by the escalating tensions of the Cold War, a rarity in the volatile Soviet hierarchy. The modified Yak-9s themselves met a melancholy fate. After the end of operations in the Pacific, they were reverted to standard configuration and incorporated into regular air defense units. None were preserved in their special configuration, and the technical documentation related to the modifications remained classified for decades. Only in files declassified in the 1990s did complete technical details emerge about the extraordinary adaptations that enabled their historic missions. For the American pilots who witnessed the impossible, Soviet fighters flying where they shouldn't be, the episode represented a stark awakening to the realities of the emerging era. As the Hellcat pilot who made the first confirmed sighting wrote in his memoirs, "At that moment I knew instinctively that the war we had just won would not be the last. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing those aircraft there, not because of any hostile action on their part, but because of the sheer determination and ingenuity that their presence represented. They didn't need to fire a single shot to send their message. No place would be uncontested in the next phase." This perception proved prophetic. In the years and decades that followed, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union would extend to every corner of the globe, from the African deserts to the ocean depths, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the vastness of space. The brief and limited presence of Yak fighters in the Central Pacific in the summer of 1945 was only the first sign of this impending global competition, a harbinger of the bipolar world to come. Operation Albatross, though small in scale, represents a fascinating case study of how military capabilities can be extended beyond seemingly insurmountable limitations through a combination of technical innovation, logistical improvisation, and operational will. The Soviets, with limited resources and under conditions of extreme secrecy, managed to project air power over distances that defied conventional analyses of their capabilities. In doing so, they not only gathered valuable intelligence, but also established a conceptual precedent that would influence their strategic thinking for decades. For the United States, the episode served as an early warning that its newly acquired dominance in the Pacific would not be unchallenged, even in the vast ocean expanses seemingly beyond the reach of potential adversaries. The lesson was clear. Technological superiority and geographical advantages by themselves would not guarantee security in a world where determined adversaries could develop innovative and asymmetrical approaches. On a broader level, the history of the Yaks in the Pacific illustrates the tense and ambiguous transition from the world of World War II to that of the Cold War. While the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are rightfully recognized as defining milestones of this transition, lesser-known episodes, such as Operation Albatross, reveal how, behind the scenes, Allies were already positioning themselves as future adversaries, even while formally cooperating to defeat a common enemy. As the last echoes of World War II faded and the realities of bipolar competition fully emerged, the lessons of the Yak in the Pacific were absorbed and developed by both sides. For the Soviets, the operation validated their belief that they could compete globally with the United States, despite economic and technological disadvantages, through innovative and often asymmetrical approaches. This conviction would underpin their strategy throughout the Cold War, from the development of intercontinental bombers to the creation of a global oceanic navy from what had essentially been a defensive coastal force. For Americans, the episode reinforced the growing perception that the Soviet Union would be a formidable and unpredictable competitor, capable of surprising technical and operational feats that defied conventional analyses of its capabilities. This assessment significantly influenced the development of American strategic posture in the following decades, contributing to an approach that combined robust military containment with cautious respect for Soviet capabilities, even when specific resources remained obscure. Ironically, as the Cold War intensified, both sides frequently overestimated the adversary's capabilities, interpreting limited demonstrations as indicative of broader, more systematic programs. The Yaks in the Pacific exemplify this phenomenon, an operation that, while impressive in terms of ingenuity and audacity, fundamentally represented an experimental and unsustainable capability. However, their mere existence fueled American perceptions of an adversary capable of materializing threats where they were least expected. This pattern of mutually distorted perceptions would characterize much of the dynamics of the Cold War, leading to cycles of action and reaction that frequently exaggerated real threats and consumed disproportionate resources. Understanding episodes like Operation Albatross in their full historical context allows us to appreciate the nuances and ambiguities that existed beneath the apparent clarity of bipolar competition, reminding us that even in the tensest moments of superpower rivalry, reality was often more complex and nuanced than contemporary narratives suggested. Today, with the benefit of historical perspective, we can assess the broader significance of the Soviet fighter planes that shouldn't have been there. They represent more than just a historical curiosity or an impressive technical feat. They symbolize human tenacity and ingenuity under pressure, complexity of alliances in transition, and the first moves of what would become the defining geopolitical confrontation of the second half of the 20th century. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of these pioneering flights lies in the questions they continue to raise about how nations assess the capabilities of potential adversaries. The Yak story in the Pacific reminds us that seemingly fundamental limitations, whether of range, logistics, or technology, can be overcome by sufficiently determined and creative adversaries. This lesson remains relevant in a world where technological superiority continues to be countered by innovative and asymmetrical approaches. In the decades following these flights, both the US and the Soviet Union developed their naval aviation capabilities. The Americans enhanced their already impressive capabilities with nuclear aircraft carriers, sophisticated carrier-based aircraft, and a global network of bases. The Soviets, recognizing that they could not compete directly, developed alternative approaches, including long-range bombers with anti-ship missiles, attack submarines capable of threatening carrier groups, and eventually their own aircraft carriers, albeit smaller and with more limited capabilities. The Yak saga in the Pacific also illuminates the importance of improvisation and adaptation. While strategists often focus on formal doctrines and advanced technologies, international competition is determined by the ability to identify opportunities and develop unconventional solutions. Operation Albatross exemplifies how a strategic need can catalyze innovations that challenge previously accepted limitations. For the pilots who flew these missions, the experience was both exhilarating and terrifying. Flying over vast expanses of ocean in aircraft ill-suited for the purpose, relying on a tenuous, improvised logistical chain, and operating in an environment dominated by a potentially hostile force, their stories represent a remarkable chapter of courage. That their feats remained unrecognized for decades adds a poignant dimension to their legacy. The engineers who made these flights possible through creative adaptations deserve equal recognition. Working with limited resources and under intense pressure, they overcame technical challenges considered insurmountable. Their contributions illustrate how human ingenuity can transcend limitations and achieve the seemingly impossible. Declassified documents released after the end of the Cold War have allowed for a more complete appreciation of Operation Albatross. Technical reports on Yak-9 modifications, logbooks from support ships, and some accounts from participants have emerged from the archives, allowing for a more accurate reconstruction of this extraordinary undertaking. As the sun set over the Pacific in August 1945, illuminating the silhouettes of Soviet fighter planes, where no analysis would have placed them, a new chapter in international relations was inaugurated. The pilots who participated in these encounters would not have known the significance of what they witnessed, but we can recognize these moments as emblematic of a world in transformation, where old enemies had been defeated, old alliances were unraveling, and new challenges were already casting their shadows on the horizon of a world irrevocably altered by war.